All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
And welcome back to part 2 of this roller coaster of upheaval within the field of archaeology, anthropology, and the origin of mankind. Now, let me just recap. There's a lot of words, we talk fast, both of us. Let me try to recap what we've done so far, and then we'll move on deeper into the story. We have this notion that going back 65,000 years, there's the so-called oration or Laurasian impulse in our storyline. And as you, Gordon, lined up for us, that's attached to some certain basic notions in our spirituality, in our paradigm. Then we go back another 20,000 or 15,000 years, actually only, to 65,000 years. For some reason, he divides that short period as a transition period, as its own segment, and he calls that the Gondwana. And there's still some traits there, like the eternity notion and also the trickster, maybe an ancient great god. And then you have the, let's just say, pre-65,000 years, because you can't really put a beginning to this. And that's
exactly
right. Pangaean, or however you pronounce it. And there are less traits. I was a little unclear, by the way. What's the associations to their paradigm?
Which paradigm?
The oldest one, Pangaean.
Well, the thing that I found particularly interesting about it is that the trickster emissary coming down from the sky is one of the oldest motifs as far as a sort of world expert on mythology can tell us. And there is an implied kind of like fall or violation of some sort of taboo. So what I was looking for, if you look at why it's called Starships with a dot in the middle, is it's a play on obviously starships and UFOs and flying saucers and so on. But it's also about navigation, and it's the story of the stars, essentially, particularly because it was written principally for Western magicians, I guess.
Which is weird. Everybody could read this book and get something.
Oh, I hope so. Please do. But yeah, when it comes to, say, I want to say star magic rather than astrology, we use the history of astrology, which is we can kind of, at least when it comes to the planets, we can date it reasonably precisely in Babylon. But if you look at Egypt, the actual star bits, it goes back to the very beginning. We have that with the pyramid text. And it goes back to the beginning of where we currently date dynastic Egypt. But for people who listen to this show, and of course me, because I wrote that book, that's unsatisfying, because Egypt is kind of like, particularly the Old Kingdom, is the end of a very old story rather than the beginning of a slightly old story, right? Obviously. So if you find this fully emerged, like fully developed star lore in the Old Kingdom, well, where did that come from? And that's where a big part of the book follows that star lore around the world. And the fact that you find 90% of Aboriginal stories associated with Orion are associated with the hunter. And that's the cosmic hunter. So, like, again, you have to be careful with this, because you don't want to suggest that non-Western cultures haven't changed over 50,000 years. The Aborigines have seen off ice ages. Like, they've been through change, right? But nevertheless, they're sort of the oldest continually practiced cultures on Earth, and their asterisms, a lot of them, obviously different words and different stories associated, but the archetype of them, the Pleiades being a group of 7 sisters and Orion as a hunter and all this kind of thing, is there. And if we it doesn't even matter if we got that from, say, the Neanderthals in Southeast Asia, which was then a continent, or if we brought it with us from Africa, it's still like Orion as hunter, as sort of star magic, is that old. Now, what does that tell us? What does that tell us about, given that I'm very Robert Bavarian about this, that you know the belt stars of Orion are in that sort of 3 pyramid Giza match and so on. So we've got this complex, this sort of Giza complex temple in a way to Orion, or a corner of the sky that's a hunter, and we've had that same sort of story for a very, very long time, and that's that is hugely significant for people who are magically operant. So that's kind of where, that's where that book goes, and I think that's
to find the most universal traits in the. But
well,
I
have this premise, right, Al, which is older isn't necessarily better, right? But oldest might be. So older isn't necessarily better.
Right, good point.
But oldest might be, especially if, we get all the way back, if there is a beginning to it, to some sort of trickster emissary coming down. And that's one of the things I wanted to play with. Because the magicians are, as you know, kind of conservative in the classical sense, where they, as a broad statement, do generally prefer old things or older things to new things. I think older is better.
Yeah, me too. But in this perspective, the what we discussed right before the break, that we can touch base anytime, anywhere.
Yes.
Then that can mean that older can be just as off track.
Yes.
And younger can be more reconnecting. But oldest would be closer to the source. So I can see that's a little problematic. It's a conundrum. Yeah. But also another interesting 180-degree turnaround here is that you're probably aware of Thor Heyerdahl, right?
Oh, of course.
One of his last projects, unfortunately he died before he could see it through, but it's still a growing thing there, is that the ancestors of the Norse people may have actually they lived around the Black Sea, and Odin was actually a tribe's leader. He was a real person. Now, we'll not go into that a lot, but from what I take from this, Loki is actually much, much older than Odin, because Loki is the trickster archetype, whereas Odin end up being just an elder, ancestor, whatever we call it. And I want you to explain us a little more about the trickster character, because many people may not even be familiar with that archetype.
Well, the word...
And it's important.
Yeah, it is. So I've had it's old now. It's about 13 years old. But I've had George P. Hansen on the show, and he wrote a very, very good book about the trickster. It's called The Trickster in the Paranormal. And the trickster as archetype is found universally, because it's at least 150,000 years old, if Witzel is even 5% correct. And it is a disruptive and teaching figure, but teaching for reasons that that are potentially not obvious to us. So the serpent in the garden is a trickster form because he tricks Eve, but he tricks...
UFOs are tricksters, goddammit.
100%. So that's what George P. Hansen is saying, which is that the broad category of paranormal phenomena that falls under UFO and often shouldn't, so Mothman and so on, displays trickster elements. And the trickster is a disruptive change form that I think, and he does, and I'm sure you do, and we might describe it differently. We use the word or the archetype of trickster, so the devil, Lucifer, Loki, what have you, as a descriptive term for extra-dimensional interaction with mankind that is sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes either it has a motive we can't see or is in fact without motives. So
and sometimes it makes trouble for us, but sometimes
absolutely
helps us. It's better to say than good and bad, because those are value judgments.
100%, and that's what's so fascinating about the Pangaean mythology that Witzel develops, because we have a trickster emissary, and we also have some sort of taboo violation, and so we have the tension of we got something but we paid something, or we got something and it broke us a little bit. And that idea is, of course, the expulsion from Eden. Like that's an example. What is that? 145,000 years later of of this kind of Pangaean idea. And that's from a magical perspective, that is hugely significant when it comes to Western magical, but not even just Western magical, because you will find the same sort of idea around the planet. It's just that I wrote for Western magicians, I guess, right? If you look at how we have historically arranged spirit lists in the grimoires and so on, you at the top more or less is Lucifer, right, in one way, shape or form, and in folk magic it's the devil and whatever. Interesting, because that is in fact the form that we find as far back, and it has that same tension. It has that same hold this at arm's length. You will get stuff out of it, but it's not without risks. And that is the UFO phenomena to a T. That is Mothman. That is all this stuff. And it, I think, says something foundationally significant about what it is to be alive in this universe.
At our level, at least. So, Starlore.
Exactly.
Starlore. Why is that so significant?
I think, well, it's a bunch of reasons. So we'll start with the not materialist, but prosaic ones. If you think about, particularly, a lot of the action we've been talking about in this episode has been before the end of the Ice Age. In fact, pretty much all of it. We think of the Ice Age as a cold time, and it is, or it was in certain parts, but it's sort of defined by the percentage of the planet's water that is locked up in ice, hence its name. Glaciers and all that kind of stuff. As a result, there is less water in the atmosphere, which means obviously there was no light pollution other than fires, but try and imagine if you've ever been out in the desert or ever been out to a dark sky national park and you look at the sky and it's like coming up on mushrooms or LSD or something just by looking at it. It is astounding. And it was the only thing on television for 200,000 years. And so what we know when we look at the kind of archaeoastronomy of Starlore around the world is that this was our calendar and our clock and our Google alert and where we stored our stories and so it has a function.
Even our porn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it has a function. It is a functional way of being in the world. Fine. I think that is enough to kind of string the thesis of the book, which is that a lot of these practices from before the end of the Ice Age have survived into Western magic. We just haven't seen them, like, Orion being a good example, right? So that's the sort of prosaic case. The next one is very metaphysical, which is like, why would that be so? And we kind of know from things like directed panspermia, like what you probably find is, particularly if the trickster came down from the stars to us, is that there is implied the sense that the stars are our home. That's sort of where, quote unquote, we come from in a way. And a really beautiful example of that, because I use a lot of Aboriginal star lore, is with the Burong people. And the Burong people are in the book for a couple of reasons. But one of the things that the Burong say, and also the Ananu in Central Australia, is the stars, when you look out at them at night, are the campfires of our ancestors who have gone home. And that is just such a beautiful idea. And you know what? It's kind of scientifically true. Like if you do the directed panspermia thing, like if life, the best case for how life even exists on this planet is that it came from elsewhere. Some kind of squishy, dirty rock. You can say it was a deliberately seeded super virus that unpacked. It can be whatever, like material that landed at least once. I think it happens continuously, and I think it's happened at least a dozen times. But that's actually true. Our oldest ancestors came from the stars, and so you have like that, and we have that story encoded.
Not only that, but but also that there's also the spiritual concept that we come from the stars, in terms of energy.
Absolutely. And it kind of comes back to the perennial philosophy thing you were talking about, which is, well, this is doubly true. It's true on a materialist level and it's true on a spiritual level. And which one came first, or is it that continuous operation of it and gaining access to it? So that's what is encoded in not encoded to be unpacked, but that is what has survived into, well, the world's magic, but it's a Western magic book. That's what survived into Western magic, and we kind of haven't seen it. That makes we've been looking for the wrong thing to have survived across hundreds of thousands of years. We've been looking for the wrong thing to survive, and it's that perennial philosophy thing you mentioned. And I just find that immensely beautiful and profoundly significant, particularly if you credit, which I do, but if you credit the idea that matter, these are difficult metaphysical words, but if you credit that matter or the universe has an interiority, so rather than, I mean, I know you like more earlier than Platonism, but I know you like the kind of vertical split. I prefer an interior, almost Jungian way to it. It's the same thing. Like it's that there is a purpose and intelligence and interiority to the universe. And it's just so fascinating that we had that idea and we told that we just, as far back as I can see, we knew that. That's amazing. And the way, because Australian Aborigines had no use for genetic information or scientific descriptions of directed panspermia and viruses from space and all that kind of thing. But they nevertheless had the exact, if anything better, they had that information in a way that was kind of philosophically or spiritually useful, which is you look out and feel connected to the wider universe because these are all the campfires of your ancestors, and you're sitting there with your campfire. And so you have this connection with the entire cosmos and an awareness of where we come from and probably where we go when it all winds up.
Yeah, I've lived in very remote places, like you have to drive half an hour to get to the closest groceries. And I can attest to the fact that nature does something with you. It's like it activates a part of an aspect of your consciousness. If we use Gebser's term, like archaic, mythic, magic, that is still there, but it's dormant in modern man. Now, the title Starships, I figured it also was a reference to the fact that Earth is a starship, and this is kind of a history of the Earth that you've done. So it works there too. But I think we should enter. I'm putting on reserve another criticism. I want to get that later. Let's enter. Why is Göbekli Tepe, and I'll also add actually Çatalhöyük, or however you pronounce that, another site not far from Göbekli Tepe, but the oldest city, I think. Yeah. Those two. Why are and you don't go that much into that, but it is connected to Göbekli. But why at all does that enter the equation?
So, because it is almost, well, for two reasons, and it's something Dr. Schock has mentioned, and I think it is correct. Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who discovered it, we spoke about him in part one, said that the cathedral predates the city, because that's what Göbekli Tepe tells us, which is his way, or was his way of saying that before we even lived, at least in that area, before we even lived in permanent structures, we built this sort of star temple on a hill. And it's large. Like the site is probably around 30 hectares, only about 10 and a half have been excavated. And it's this beautiful and astounding, circular, enclosure D and some of the earliest layers, because it is, you mentioned Çatalhöyük, the later layers, and we're talking about, after 8,500, after about 7,000 actually BC, they go from these circular structures into more rectangular structures that are recognizable in Çatalhöyük. But the earliest layers, which are older than Çatalhöyük, and probably older still, because it's this big hill, and you have to dig from the top, obviously, because that's how...
No, hang on. When you said they haven't excavated everything, you were talking about area, but have they done that in depths too?
Not to any sort of satisfaction. Like, I mean, how could you? Because you have to kind of dig down in a... in a reasonable way so that you don't destroy the earlier layers. But the site itself is around 30 hectares. And there are more not being discovered, because the fact that it exists at all is this sort of improbable, just astounding event, because it's so old. But the cathedral predates the city, because before we lived in settled structures, in permanent structures or in settled groups, we seem to have got together and built a star temple on a hill. So at the very least, what that tells us is that the questions that you and I are interested in on a lifetime basis were the same questions that people 12,000 years ago were interested in, which is where we come from, what's it about, and so on. And that is a crucial statement, or Göbekli Tepe is a piece of evidence that dismantles the previous and materialist idea, and Marxist, and all the sort of children of materialism, that the way civilization works is we're hunter-gatherers, and that wasn't that good, which is wrong. And then we get agriculture, and that was slightly better. But what agriculture does is stratify society, so you have farmers and kings and whatever. But because you have a harvest, you get to sit around and make up stories about how the universe works, and that's where religion comes from. So the cathedral is supposed to come after the city as an invention of farmers sitting around a fire at the end of the day, and that's how you get things like a Marxist dismissal of quote unquote religion or spirituality. And Göbekli Tepe disproves it. We weren't in that area, and farming is I've just bought a farm, but like it's an area I'm particularly interested in. We define farming in a sort of, we have like wheat centrism when it comes to farming, because actually we've been gardening for 100,000 years. So we've been working with the world of plants to make sure they and we can live for much, much longer. But we weren't farming anything in the sense of grain when we built this. So the cathedral predates the city. That is so important. That is so important for sort of marshalling the arguments against that materialist interpretation of history, because it fails. What it also does secondarily is it elevates our Paleolithic ancestors to at least our level, because they're thinking the same things, and they have art and they have music and cosmology, and they can clearly work together in groups, because no one lived there. No one lived at Göbekli Tepe. So it was
not
probably
even keepers of the site.
Not as far as you can tell. There's no water. So if there was a keeper, they would
hang on. It's so long ago. How do they know there wasn't water back
then?
Well,
no, not being able to tell if there was any nearby water is actually kind of easy.
Okay.
But the actual climate was much, much nicer. So you have sort of grasslands and pistachio trees, and this is sort of one of the things that Klaus Schmidt said.
How old do we know at a minimum that Göbekli Tepe is?
So
because it's a crucial question if it predates the Ice Age.
Well, it absolutely does, because the enclosures that get the most sort of alternate interest are right on the edge of the Ice Age for reasons that I think maybe aren't that good. But we're sort of talking in the 10,000 to 9,000 BC is where you have the most interesting enclosures, which is sort of D and C and B. So, and that lines up with some of the archaeoastronomy that the likes of Dr. Schock has done about what I don't want to say what they describe, but the matches between the actual T-pillar structures in these earliest enclosures that we've excavated and the stars. So you kind of have a Pleiades, Taurus, top half of Orion situation going on. And what I think, and I don't know how we'd work, well, someone needs to work it out, but so the two main pillars in the beginning, in the center, are surrounded by sort of a circle of smaller T-pillars that are all sort of facing in. And it was a musical site, like these giant sort of T-pillars are sort of gently resting, and Dr. Schmidt called them sort of like two angels just gently resting onto Earth. So
like tuning forks, right?
Yeah, you hit them and they hum. So, and it probably created a standing wave, like if you think about how that works. So they weren't just using, it wasn't just a site for music in the sense that it's a guitar made of stone, although it is that. They were probably, and this is kind of why we then move on to Egypt in the book, they were probably using sound and stone in a way that alters consciousness that we cannot recover. We just know we might be able to recover it, but like
in a small scale,
we just know that they are. We don't know what it's for. We just know that they were.
It's still elements in certain esoteric systems, but it's a good point that it's not just for, it wasn't the guitar around the campfire.
No, the implications.
Let's sing Kumbaya. It was more to do with spirituality and maybe also we can't disregard the metaphysical component in terms of exotic technology.
Absolutely. That's what I mean.
Okay.
That's what I mean. I think the Old Kingdom is the end of a 50,000-year project of using stone and music and stars together as, shall we say, like our earliest, not our earliest form of magic. You know what I mean? There's a 50,000-year stone, stars, probably drugs and sound combination that it's recoverable, but we won't ever know what it is. We just know that they were playing this game at a level of sophistication which we no longer do. And that's really important, because when I say something like that, people want the antediluvian civilization to be...
Yeah, we're going to get to that, believe me.
Yeah. They want it to be all the kind of crystal running computers, high technology Atlantis stuff, which it doesn't need to. I'm more interested, as potentially you are, in the metaphysics of it. So, yeah.
Let's not go there yet, Gordon. But you said 50,000 years. Could it be that old?
Oh, Göbekli Tepe probably isn't, but we do have the sort of use of stone around the world, stone circles, that kind of thing that goes back, I would say. Well, let's just say 35 for now. But
then no, but that's important, because if it's 35, it's part of the Laurasian culture. If it goes further than 40, then it's also a trait of the Gondwana.
Well, Gondwana starts at 65 according to...
sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. No, yeah, it starts at, but it ends at 40. So Gondwana would have it if it's older than 40. Of course, these lines, these borders aren't clear cut, but
exactly. But I would. It makes more sense to me, not intuitively. It makes more sense to me that if there is a architectural and magical change in the story of mankind, it would probably be kind of all the one thing. So what Witzel calls Laurasia and what Dr. Joanna Nichols, who did the linguistic research, calls that kind of second development in culture and whatever. It just seems to me that we have these things that could probably date from approximately the same time, and they're all kind of like different blind men on the same elephant. Yeah. So that's a guess, whatever. But Göbekli Tepe is in there because it shows that we were playing a kind of star music and probably drugs and stone game better than we sort of realized. And also, it's in such this bizarre place that as a result, it's the same. All modern wheat is descended from the sort of hills in the general Göbekli Tepe area. Wine isn't from that far off. So these notions that we have that have retained in mythology, that we learned a lot of these skills from, beings that taught us these things coming down from the stars. And we have a temple that implies verticality and is pointed at the stars in the area where we first start using these things. And we come back to that, well, is it a physical description? Is it a mesophysical? Is it both at the one time? And Göbekli Tepe is that. It's our Rosetta Stone for being able to understand the Paleolithic, because it's right on the edge of where that fundamental Paleolithic to Neolithic change happens. It's right on the edge of going from before farming to after farming. So we have motifs and things that we can relate to as a post-agricultural or post-agrarian sort of civilization and before it. So it's actually a Rosetta Stone, because it's a real challenge otherwise to get your head in the world of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and what have you. Because how could you? I mean, where is our way into this, right? And Göbekli Tepe provides and will provide more, but is at least one of them, because it's this site that is sort of written in both of those languages, if that makes sense.
But you said Rosetta Stone, and I think that's a good description, because the symbolism of this site, I mean, one thing is the geology aspect, but as a magician, but also as any truth seeker, we should also look closely at the symbolism aspect.
Yeah, sure.
It appears to me we're dealing with archetypal origins of, for example, the modern astrology.
Yep.
Notions. Let's go a little into this symbolism, because I think...
But let me just jump in, and why it's a Rosetta Stone in that case is when we look at astrology, particularly the history of astrology is done by people who probably don't practice it. You get the idea that we only needed a calendar when it was time to plant crops. That's the stupidest goddamn thing ever, right? Yeah. And Göbekli Tepe proves it, because these people weren't planting crops, and they have an archaic version of what will end up in Alexandria 10,000 years later as a recognizable, and also in India and also in China, as like a recognizable essentially star map of astrology. And they weren't farming. So it's another one of those cathedral predates the city moments, because the sort of permanent argument against the idea that astrology is really, really, really old, and it is and it isn't, is, oh, well, we only invented calendars to farm. And I'm like, go and ask a farmer if he needs to like look at the sky to tell you when to put the broad beans in, because I don't.
The weather, the cycles are more important. But
now we actually have the site to show that we have not just the star lore that is in Australian Aboriginal cultures, but we actually have what appears to be star maps before we needed that sort of planting calendar. So it's so important. It's that Rosetta Stone what it does is kicks open the door of timelines. It kicks open the door so that we can start thinking about the story of, well, global magic, but again, Western magic on much, much longer timelines than we'd previously been allowed to do. And I love it for that.
One of the big cracks in the mainstream paradigm about the antediluvian, or I should say pre-Ice Age culture, is precisely artifacts, because you have disturbing finds like those of Gondwana. You're probably aware of him.
Sure,
and of course in anthropology, similar stuff like Michael Cremo. Now, I'd say if we're dealing with, this is why I think symbolism is important, because in Gondwana's case, for those who don't know, he's a collector and he's collecting stuff from all over the world, but he has found a pattern of what you can only call a Proto-Sanskrit, which means that, I mean, if Sanskrit is the oldest written language that has survived, then a Proto-Sanskrit would indicate that there was a more homogenic culture, maybe not an homogenic anthropology, but at least a kind of a culture for the advanced aspects in terms of writing down stuff, symbolism, that, who knows, maybe it went across the so-called species, or I'd say the ethnicities of man who was reigning in the world, which is pretty interesting because it could either indicate a closer connection between the different cultures, or this is the chicken and egg again, but a common source, which is much older and probably otherwhere than the out of Africa theory. But if you have that, then how does the Göbekli Tepe symbolism compare to the other oldest symbolism that we know? Because I've seen, and I just want to throw in one more thing, and I've seen that this symbolism in Göbekli Tepe is found many places around the world.
It is. So if you're talking about things like the curious, I was about to say similarity, but the carved hands on, for example, the T-pillars are more or less identical to the carved hands on the Moai and on Easter Island. And that's true. And again, you're dealing with a 10,000 year gap. So it seems that I would prefer what we're calling in this conversation a metaphysical explanation for that, rather than some sort of physical survival from southeast Turkey to Easter Island, right?
So the invisible hand, both literally and metaphor.
But, I mean, this is the right sort of show to have this conversation. But whatever the temple at Göbekli Tepe is built for, I think that whatever that entity is in some sense real. That's a fair thing to say, I think. So if it's real, that means...
With real, you mean manifested in matter?
No, I mean like whatever the spirit of the hunter in that hunter's temple I assert as being ontologically valid. So whether it's Orion, you can call it Orion the god, you can call it whatever you want. Watineru in Ananyu, like, if that's the case, then the people who constructed the Moai, and as to the how and why of that, that's obviously an open question of its own. But I think that's evidence for the fact that there is a reality to whatever this temple is built for. And that's why you get so many of these motifs. And it's sort of why it gets challenging, and it's a separate book. If you look at some of the, I'd only follow a few of them through because they map to Egypt. But if you look at the actual carvings in Göbekli Tepe from the enclosures that we've actually excavated, you probably could do a sort of Witzel-esque match to other places where that motif is, because it's the oldest temple. But let's be clear, in many respects 10,000 BC isn't that old when you're like, I love cave art and all that kind of stuff. Like it's interesting as a Rosetta Stone, but it's certainly not the origin of spiritual thought. It's certainly not the origin of symbolic thinking or any of that. It's again one of those cases where
it may actually be the end of it.
Agreed.
More than the origin.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's one of those endpoints. But Yeah, so like you can follow the symbolism in those directions. I only pick the ones like headlessness and the sort of ibis and other things that show up in Old Kingdom Egypt. Again, big gaps later. I pick the ones that work in that broader thesis, which is that our understanding of quote unquote star magic, which is circuitously described in, say, Hermeticism, is extremely old. Is in fact extremely old. And what entertains me about that idea is that they thought that at the time. It's just that they got all the words for it because they didn't have history. Like, they got all the words for it wrong. So that
they may have. I mean, they burnt Library of Alexandria and stuff.
Well, no, I mean things like the idea that the pyramids were the tombs of Moses and Hermes Trismegistus.
history
are scientifically wrong, but they're also lyrically correct, because these are structures that encode both these really ancient origins of some of these ideas. So they're talking lyrically rather than literally. And so I find that hilarious that in many respects the people getting around in classical Egypt and in the early sort of Arab days of Egypt, and they kind of thought these were the tombs of former prophets from before the flood and all that. And that's not correct, but it's also not wrong. And I that is fascinating to me.
Yeah, and it's a tomb in another aspect too, and that is go there, leave your body behind, then travel.
Exactly.
But Soma. But another thing is that Göbekli Tepe falls in line with the transition from the end of the Ice Age, and that's significant. We have speculation, of course, about why it's buried or how it was buried. Do you have any reflections about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I love Dr. Schock. We've sort of corresponded in and around this book. I think he's brilliant, and I rely on his work for a lot of stuff. I think he's wrong about, and Hancock and the rest of them, I don't think have really thought through the idea that we delicately buried this temple as like a warning to mankind. That
I loved that portion in your book. I've been thinking that all the time. You say it with your ordinary sharp, dry humor, but when on earth has anyone cared for their kids or their grandchildren, right?
Never. I mean, it's not the story of...
We're having our heads up on in our asses. I think, if anything, it points backwards in time. It doesn't
I think so. So we find in Egypt that temples, because they're, Egypt's, as preaching to the choir here, Egypt's probably older than, well, it is older than the kind of dynastic calendar we have for it, right? But even just within dynastic Egypt, because it went for so long, the stellar alignments of the temples fell out because of precession. So you kind of had to rebuild the temples, and there's plenty of evidence that they would do this. A similar thing appears to have happened in Sumer, which is closer in well, it's a closer parallel to what happened at Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the reasons these sites are so well preserved, is that they were delicately buried with small rocks, as if you're kind of packing to move. And some of this seems to line up with the fact that, because it was used for so long, the stars that they pointed at probably fell out of alignment. So you have to build a new one, because it doesn't, the sky ground match, which we have survived in the Old Kingdom and Hermeticism and so on, no longer works. So I think that's the case. I think what happens is
they close a chapter of the book and have to start writing a new one.
Because if it works,
and you don't destroy the previous chapters just
you
because
can't. It's a temple, and that's what Sumer would do. In Sumerian culture, we have 2 or 3 examples of temples that cease being used being delicately packed up. And sort of deactivated, if you will, because you can't destroy them.
But do we know for sure?
No, that's my guess.
No, but in Egypt, the pyramids are naturally buried. Do we know for sure that Göbekli Tepe and the Sumerian stuff are intentionally buried?
Yes, that's
significant.
It is. It's intentionally buried, so they weren't destroyed by anything, or we wouldn't have got them. We wouldn't have got the complex later, but they were intentionally packed up, if you will.
So it's the reasons for why they were buried. You differ with the simpleton thinking that it's to preserve it for the ancestor. That's where you differ.
A warning for future mankind. It was definitely the archaeology of it is universal, and it's one of those things that you can actually ask the roulette maker about, like, this is a deliberately buried site, because their whole job is digging through layers of dirt, so they know the difference between deliberate and naturally occurring dirt. And so that is significant, but I think as to the why, I think it's because it fell out of alignment with whatever the stars that were most important to it at the time were. And we sort of see that reflected in cultures that I think, in particular the case of the Old Kingdom, in cultures that I think are almost in a funny way, and I want people to listen carefully to what I'm saying. They are, in a funny way, a continuity of the same star ground culture. The survivors of Göbekli Tepe didn't go to Egypt and found Egyptian civilization or anything as dumb as that, but the same almost like ritual magic behavior is found just at a much more advanced level in Old Kingdom Egypt than Göbekli Tepe. So I think it's my assertion, but I think it's a reasonable one, that you can kind of look at, well, it seems to be an alignment issue that's why it's why it's a big hill. They kept building on top of each other and sort of packing the ones underneath it. Because, and why would you do that? Well, you do that if it has to work as a ritual site, if it has to be that combination of sound and star and stone to get the magical and metaphysical effect. That seems like that's the best case to me.
We've always been building on top of older sacred sites.
100%. What I think Graham, if he ever does another book, and it's just so difficult from an archaeology perspective to do it. And also you're dealing with active sacred sites in India. But I think he's right that the ones that will have some of the most paradigm changing impact would be in India. And that you build from scratch very often. So it's unclear what you would actually find if you tried to dig under temples, which you can't do in India anyway, because they're still being used. Exactly. But I think that's I think you will find, it would be my guess that many Hindu temple sites have been used since like Laurasia, right? Like, honestly, I think that is a place you would find temples that have been used for 20,000 years, no question.
But if your hypothesis is correct, then we can infer one more thing from that, and that's that the site must be much older than we thought, because if the stars go out of alignment, you just imagine when they built it, it must have been the last time it went out of alignment.
Well, yeah, but it's an absence of evidence challenge, and we have Egypt to what's the word I'm looking for here? Egypt is the kind of case that you can use to sort of backcast to Sumeria and sideways cast to somewhere like India, because if you look at the satellite surveys and this isn't Old Kingdom stuff, this is just through general dynastic Egypt, satellite surveys of all the sort of temples up and down the Nile, you see, even with the smaller ones in particular, you can see that they have been moved small amounts over the course of time. So we know that it was a requirement that, and I get this magically, but we know that it was a requirement that they had to match. And that idea is clearly there at the beginning of the Old Kingdom. So they got it from somewhere. And then it's a question of lining up what things came before the Old Kingdom that we can find. And Göbekli Tepe is a very important piece of that story.
If they were just pragmatists, if this didn't have any objective function, then they would just alter the significance of what the different pointers were. You know what I mean? So, okay, now it's out of line, but let's reinvent the mythology here. No, we have to stick to the objective truth. So we have to actually physically rebuild the sites that are supposed to transfer these meanings, which means that there's a physical component here, which is actually
100%
valid.
Yeah, agreed. And that is again kind of borne out in, the last 120 years of sci and paranormal research, that there are arrangements of things like stones and people and places on the earth that have measurable psi effects. And we're just kind of, I use this metaphor in the blog a bunch, but in many respects, the 20th century and trying to trying to go on this journey is kind of like a Roswell crash, like an actual Roswell crash, because we have we had the pieces of a broken spaceship. That's the sort of story of Western magic and what we understand from Egypt and so on. We have the pieces of it, and we can all try and put it back together, but it might work, it might not, but nevertheless, it's a spaceship.
Mm-hmm. Well, if they did build, I mean, we build, like I said earlier, we build still on top of older.
Yes, exactly.
And wasn't it that when they found Göbekli Tepe, it was still in the current culture that lives there now, there was still lore about this being somehow, if not sacred, at least some kind of superstition around the place?
Yes, sort of. What appears to have happened and why it survived, because it's. I mean, I wrote this book in London when I was living there. And what fascinates me about living somewhere like London is that you can lose entire Victorian factories, and the Victorian era wasn't that long ago. And then all of a sudden you're building Crossrail, and you find like. Usually it's gross stuff like a plague pit or what have you, but like you miss whole factories that are only like 150 years old until you find it again.
Exactly.
And you try to think back 12,000 years, the improbability of something that would survive. And what appears to have happened in the case of Göbekli Tepe is that it was believed to be a Muslim graveyard. So
sacred place.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you can't disturb and it's a good idea, but in Islam you can't disturb the bodies or the graves of the dead.
Yeah, that's common. The curse of the Indian burial place.
Exactly. Yeah, so you just leave it alone, and that appears to have been what protected it in the sense of no one really noticed it until and Klaus Schmidt wasn't the first person to survey it either. It was actually surveyed by an American archaeological group, and they missed what it was after the war. And Klaus Schmidt saw it and said, actually, I think this is probably something, and found it. But the very fact that it survived is just this remarkable. It might be fate, it might be coincidence. It depends how you want to use those words. But it was this sort of string of extremely improbable events that led to its survival.
Synchronicity, I guess we can call it.
Yeah, it's a good word.
But that's why stone is what we end up in every time we go far back, because that's what survives. But the problem with that is that people then deduce that, okay, that means stone was king, and that's all there was. And then now we're getting closer to one of my criticisms, maybe, of your stuff, because you said it yourself. You just made a case for it. 100 years ago, we discover stuff that's gone or only in 100 years. We can't know to what extent the advancement, or I should say the technological aspect, was prevailing. I'm pretty sure that if they had ancient technology, stuff that we could maybe call technology, although I do agree that it conflates into the spiritual. But if they did have that, the spiritual component would still be king. They wouldn't be materialists, so that's a big difference, right? So, but if we can acknowledge that if they had advanced tools, they would still have the same. I mean, it doesn't do anything to rule out the main message in your book, that this is metaphysical and maybe also transcendent. That we agree about, but that in itself doesn't exclude a technological component. And of course, people think they find, you've said that cities like London or Athens, right? But we know, and we have to, you're into this too, to try to square all data pieces into the same puzzle. We know that there is extremely ancient advanced technology that doesn't cope. We know that, and you interviewed Brandenburg. If there was a nuclear war that long ago, and you Tom van Flandern, Exploding Planet, but we don't even have to go there. We know that there's been nuclear, the same signatures is, I think, in Iraq and India. We found batteries that are very old.
So I don't think, because I spoke to Dr. Schock about that. There's that kind of idea that there is nuclear. Well, there's there is a half-life reading that could be a nuclear weapon in India. He's heard that story for 25 years as well, and he's been looking for it. That's his whole job, and hasn't found it. So that one, I think, is probably not correct. I know where you, like, here's the thing. The thesis of the book, I expected to find, and I've been looking since I've been a teenager, a high civilization as sort of origin of, in this case, shall we say, star magic. And you don't need it. Like, this is the point. The way I've used the empirical evidence and taken it back, you don't need it if magic works, to put it another way. And so that's what I think. And here's the thing. There may well be. My favorite example is whatever the hell is off the western tip of Cuba.
Right.
That looks, because it's at the bottom of the ocean and no one's allowed to look at it, and it's probably the origins of the Olmecs. But the thing is, if you follow the evidence that we do have available to us now, you don't actually need to get to the whole, well, maybe they had advanced technology or not.
Yeah, but we know there is technology that we have discovered that is very ancient. Well, they found only, let's be moderate, in Mediterranean, they found batteries.
Yeah, batteries aren't that, like, that's, I don't consider that advanced, put it that way. And here's the thing. I agree completely, because I'm very interested in the sort of geopolymer process, Davidovit's hypothesis for how the pyramids were built, right? Well, at least 1.5 of the Giza pyramids, right? So I'm very, very interested in that. I think the quote unquote, the trouble is we say high technology and you jump straight to battery, but I think they were, and this is what Davidovits said, is that we've become, in the last 2,000 years, we are a chemical civilization. The Paleolithic was a sort of geological or stone civilization. So they were as good at stones as we are chemical.
Because that's what survived.
But also the geopolymer process shows it. So we can't actually see their high technology because we look for batteries.
Right.
And I don't think that's right. Right. So yes, is the case. And it's sort of the whole point of the book was to give people what I think is the most up-to-date and valuable information from which to go looking for it. Because we're looking for land speeders and other Star Wars toys and buzz saws and things in Giza, and we haven't found them, and we don't need them.
No, I understand that, and I understand you haven't bought into the mainstream, but there's two things that doesn't square together. One is the mainstream says we were primitive and then we advanced gradually, and that's of course easy to debunk. Now the other one says that we were advanced, then we fell, and then we had to try to restore. And of course Göbekli Tepe can be used in both cases. But if you say we don't need it, we still, it's not that I think we need it, it's that we have to explain how we can have those components fitting into a more, I don't want to use the word primitive because they were anything but a more basic culture, a more in touch with nature culture, could still have what we could call technology only as a slave, instead of today technology is master. But they could have it as a slave. And I'd say battery doesn't square with what the mainstream says they would. No, bombs wouldn't. Anti-gravity certainly wouldn't. Advanced sound technology wouldn't.
Well, here's the thing. Anti-gravity, I wouldn't use that word, but what I would say is that we know now that there are certain sonic processes that appear to reduce the mass of objects.
Right.
Now, that is high technology, but you landed on battery, and I'm trying to say the technology, quote unquote, that we're talking about is stone. And I think they use geopolymer liquid processes. And I think the reason they did that, one, because it's just how you build something as enormous as the pyramids and as precise as the pyramids and all that kind of thing. But
in South America, you have the same phenomenon. Huge structures, fine cut.
Sure. Absolutely. Those those marshmallow bricks that are they look like they're only half solid, and that appears to be that geopolymer process. I get that. I also get that the use of sound and potentially psi capacities can reduce the mass of objects. But I don't. You'll have to point the books out to me, Al, that say that rather than the ones that go calling Giza a power plant and actually try into some kind of crude battery. If you're referring to the Baghdad battery, that's a mild chemical reaction that can be used to electroplate things or potentially run a light, but probably was used for electroplating because we have examples of that. So I don't see that as like, aha, Atlantis. But I do, like, I think the parts of quote unquote high technology that we see self-evidently in Egypt are the things that most people in the alternative world won't get their heads around, which is the technology we're talking about is stone. And we hear that and we just think chisels, but it's not. They were liquefying this stuff. They were creating things that used a combination of sound and stone for, frankly, magical reasons.
Well, there are artifacts that are out of place, but instead of losing ourselves in that, because I'm not a professional who can hit you in the head with all those factoids, I'd rather take the big picture then. Now, you agree that mankind goes back, and we don't even have to go to the Neanderthals. It goes back so far in time, advanced mankind, and actually the mainstream says that we've been more or less unchanged physically for, I think they now pushed it back to 200,000 years. So
a bit more now.
Yeah, maybe even more. But let's say 200,000 then. So what we are today was around at least that long.
Yep.
And I believe in millions of years and Cremo and all that. But we don't have to go there. Let's use Occam's razor. Okay. So then we see that there are advancement in thinking. So we debunk the ape-man culture theory. There's advancement in thinking. There's advancements in consciousness. There's advanced tools. Let's just say that without pointing out how mechanical or whatever they are, technological they are.
Okay.
So we know that. Then we see the culture today. No, there's one more component. And then we see that the further back you go, the more everything is erased. The only thing surviving is stone. Now let's just use basic rationality here. Today, we are able to build a so-called advanced civilization. If there was a huge catastrophe, not much of it would be left, especially not after 10,000 years, 20,000 years, you name it, 50,000 years. What would be left of our culture? Almost nothing.
Yeah.
Now, it's basic logic that if we are able to make planes today, there's no rule in cosmos saying that our ancestor wouldn't be able to do it. I don't say that the world today was around exactly like this 100,000 years ago.
Oh, sure.
But the advancement...
As I said, you don't need it for the thesis, Al.
Pardon?
You don't need it for the thesis. The whole point of the book is to follow back the things we can actually know, and I do say at several points in the book. Yeah. That's all I'm doing. I don't rule out two things. I don't think humans evolved from monkeys. I don't think the morphological or data information is there. That's not in the story because that happened, whatever that was, millions of years ago. So it's not the story that's in Starships. And also, because I can only see as far back as the genetic and linguistic and whatever evidence goes, that's where I pick up the story. And I say a couple of times, like, there may well have been. But here's the thing. I don't see that in the story of the kind of prehistory of Western magic. I see the memory of it, absolutely. I see the memory of it, but I don't see it, and it's not needed for the thesis in the book. But yeah, I agree. As I said, like
for these 150,000 years, it's not needed for those.
Absolutely not. And in that is a sufficient time sample for you to look at the evidence we have and then make the metaphysical or spiritual implications about what it is to be human and on this planet and in relation to the stars. So absolutely, that's what the book's about. I still think if there is an actual quote unquote Atlantis, the best case for it is whatever is off the western tip of Cuba, but
not Antarctica.
No, I don't think that one's. I think there's clearly stuff in Antarctica. I think you and I spoke about that on my show. I think that's off-world stuff. I don't think that's the sort of the Atlantis of myth, if you will.
No, doesn't have to be Atlantis of myth, but it's been pristine. It's even more pristinely buried than Göbekli Tepe. So I think we will find to what degree they were advanced under there. But again, just to push you one last time on this before we move on, there's nothing special with our culture today. If anything, you can say we are at a lower consciousness today. Maybe that's also why we're excelling in matter, in detailing mechanics of matter, because that's where we have our perspective.
Yeah,
but
I think so.
There's nothing exceptional about us biologically, consciousness, culturally. If anything, we are very degenerated.
Sure.
And still I'm able to meet you tomorrow if I really want to. Now, it's superstition to think that's not possible 50,000 years ago, 100,000.
I didn't say that though.
I know. But I'm just, I wanna hear what you have to say about it, because it's an important perspective. Because
I don't need it for the story. I don't need it for the story of, as far as I can see, the sort of origins of Starlore, and not even origins, but as far back as I need to see from a time sample perspective. And if the whole book is about resetting the available evidence we have, because you've just used the Flemath stuff and whatever from Antarctica, and this is based on older geological information that just isn't as good anymore. And so the whole point of the book is like, let's update a bunch of the information about things we do know, and then have these questions, have these discussions.
I get that, but leave alone the book now.
When you say it's superstition, like 50,000 years ago, I appreciate absence of evidence is, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Right. That's fine. The book isn't closing the door on this stuff. It's saying you don't need it. So how about we update the stuff we do know and then go looking, because we spin off in the wrong directions. Like I said, land speeders and power plants and whatever. And it's just, it's this cluster of garbage that I want to burn down and put something else in place so we can continue that quest.
We don't need it. Okay, we don't need it. But 100,000 years from now, they don't need that either to explain us today. But if it was there, and I appreciate that your book can afford taking that component into it. But my point is, we should have that component being able to take that into a paradigm. And I do believe your book, like you said, you don't exclude it, and it's room for that component in your book.
I think
but
so.
I felt you dismissed too lightly. You touched too, and then because of evidence absence, but you did dismiss too lightly the notion of, let's say then, Antarctica or the Cataclysm. Because, well, if you don't, you push it very far back, and for some reason the southeastern is more or less an origin point in your mind for that. Could you explain to us why you point out southeastern?
That's the accumulation. That's the accumulation of all available evidence we do have. Again, the genetics, the linguistics, the geology, the end of the ice age, etc., suggests that something happened there at that sort of 40,000 year point. And more crucially, particularly once you get to Gunung Padang, this is the oldest kind of allowed proto-pyramid structure, and it happened at where we have the genetic admixture with the other hominins, we have the linguistic and evidence, and we lost a landmass twice the size of India at the end of the Ice Age. So if you're looking for the memory of, and I think it's both, if you were looking for the idea that the end of the Ice Age survived in some sense in the world's mythologies and religions and so on, and I think it did. The best case for that is here, where we have not just the observable development of cultural complexity at that point, but also the genetic ties back from the Americas and Eurasia and Europe to this particular point. So the evidence for, if you were looking for...
And it aligns with Blavatsky's Lemuria, actually.
Of course, it does. But for me, that's the best case for it. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do, because particularly like in the premium members course, when we did things like the history of the grimoires and what have you, so much... There are so many things that are wrong that we have inherited that are getting in the way of being able to have a better version of this quest, right? And so that's sort of the point of the book. And again, the point of the book is the origin, like a prehistory of the spirits. Like I'm tracing the story of a kind of cluster of practices and spirits in a specific grimoire sense. Because I got people saying, well, why isn't there anything about the Americas in it? And I'm like, because that's not... I can't do the whole history of the world. I'm just telling you that the kind of the star and star spirit stuff that we see in a sort of Western magical tradition specifically can go back that far, and this is what I can see. So I'm open to it. It's just that I have done this for 20 years. It gets to this point and someone says absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. That's fine. Stop using it as this catch-all explanation for things. Let's approach this with a little bit more rigor, because I think we'll find more interesting things when that happens. So that was my main target was ancient aliens, but the secondary target was a lot of that
Atlantis.
Egypt was founded by descendants of a high civilization, and it's a partial credit answer at best, put it that way.
Well, I said if we can do it today, we could have done it before, and I said, and I also said that if there's only stone that will be traces, and that we know that today. Still, we don't build in stone, so we are even.
Yeah, I know, right?
Right, we have had even more up our asses than they did, but
yeah,
it aligns with another logical thing, and that is that. It doesn't have to be, and I know you're aware of this, but we have to say it also for the sake of this subject. There doesn't have to be one big cataclysm. More likely there's been several reboots, which could afford some kind of Atlantis, even in Lemuria.
Sure.
And even if there's really a retained memory of a huge catastrophe, a huge fall, then we're actually starting to touch areas like Joseph Farrell, who builds up on...
Cosmic War stuff. I love that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
So let's
Agreed.
say 65 million years ago, maybe there was more like today.
Agreed.
Because then you can also tie in Brandenburg and stuff like that.
And I actually do. It's not in the book, but I think, do you remember that terrible film version of Final Fantasy? Not Final Fantasy. I think there are, in that kind of, however things like remote viewing, Akashic records, whatever words you want to use for it, right? Mm-hmm. I think shamans, wizards, whatever, have access to kind of like the story of the universe. And I also think in a weird, and this is a crude way of describing it, but you'll understand what I mean. Mm-hmm. I also think the kind of spirit impact or ghosts or lingering, almost like Scientological remains of things like the Cosmic War are available to us. The thing with the book I am getting across is that you don't have to have we don't have to have 65 million years of physical evidence to trace humans back to this Cosmic War, which I'm a very pro-Brandenburg kind of situation. We don't have to, because
Anton van Vlaanderen.
Yeah, sure. Because magic works. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's the story of this is retained in some sense in the spirit world. So of course,
like an echo.
Yes, but it might also be in some sense real. It might be that these entities that were the same, whatever their gods were, for instance, may well be spirits and things. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm kind of interested in, because yes, here we have this story of, say, 150,000 years to now, which is what Starships is about. Its implications actually open the door rather than close the door to the kind of Cosmic War stuff that I'm super into. I don't like when people try to physically connect it. And I like some of Cremo's evidence, but he has his own religious reasons for putting it together the way he does.
Yeah, but everybody has their own religion. No,
sure.
That doesn't...
He just gets off more lightly than I do. That's my point, because I hang my magic flag at the front of on the door. You kind of have to get deep into Cremo before you find it, right? So... And I think a lot of that stuff, I've got all this stuff. I'm looking at my giant pink forbidden archaeology right now. I think a lot of that...
No, but you make a good case for this, because if it's ingrained in our spirituality, in our astral echo, that's even worse for the ancient astronaut hypothesis, because that means that you can reboot culture on Earth. You can wipe out everything.
Yeah, 100%.
You can come back.
Yeah.
And it's still there as an echo, and that may explain, there may not even be a direct link in terms of culture and physicality to whatever havoc they caused millions of years ago.
Absolutely. 100%.
Right?
Yeah.
But we're just rediscovering what they did then, right now.
Yep. Yeah. I think so. I also think a lot of Cremo stuff is probably evidence of time travel rather than physical survivals. But yeah.
Sure, but that's purely philosophical. That's
Sure. But
part two.
Yeah, part 3. Aren't we on part 2?
We're soon done here, by the way. But I just want to say these points at the end here, and also I think we can say that if it's room for that kind of thinking, then I lost my train of thought, of course. Okay. But it's basically this is basically the materialism history versus the cultural history. And
I wouldn't say that. I would say I'm using empirical evidence to demonstrate where empirical evidence can and can't go.
Right.
So, but it absolutely, and I'm happy about that because I absolutely am. I consider it in the current of books that includes things like Sitchin, because he did the best he could with the available data, sort of. So did I. We both have access to grind. And yeah, so I would say it that way. I wouldn't say it's a materialist one. I would say I'm trying to give what I think, and it's good evidence, I'm trying to give the evidence to sort of magical people to say, as a matter of fact, it's not a binary between listening to mainstream academia and listening to Blavatsky. There's the story is there for us to explore. So let's do it.
Yeah.
Oh my God, what a great place to end.
Absolutely. And your book is very much about timelines. And I also want to say there's a structure and order in your book that I recommend people to check out, because much of what we've been throwing out here today in this conversation is traceable in your book. You touch most of it and you structure it for us. So it's a very surveying way to get, you go into details many places about many of these things, Egypt, Göbekli Tepe, the ancient stuff. So it's a very useful book to have, even if you're not even buying into your approach. It still has a value on many levels.
Nice.
So I do recommend people get it. It's underrated in many ways. And I say, and I support you in that it can also be a supplement to the perspective that man, more than aliens, has been, around and been advanced.
Oh, for sure.
Because this deals with what we can afford to accept from the mainstream for the last 150,000 years. So it's like you're cleaning up the mainstream contribution.
I like that.
Yeah. So that's great. Just before you go, I know we're pressed for time here. Could you just give us information about your other books?
Oh, sure. So Starships is my first book. It's from Scarlet Imprint, so you can buy it. Best is from the publisher website, scarletimprint.com, although there is Kindle versions available on Amazon. If you want the real book, you have to get it from real people. My second book is The Chaos Protocols, which is it's about magic. It's a book about magic in our current economic climate. And the third one is Kindle only. It's Pieces of 8. And that's little essays and enchantments in a specific chaos magic world. So those are the 3 books so far, and everything else, the show and whatever, is runesoup.com.
Yeah,
and
highly recommended, including your interview with me.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thanks a lot for your time. I know I've been pressing you here, but we'll have you back then later. Okay.
All right, that was really fun.
Yep, it was.
Oh, it's been wonderful.
Yep.
It's wonderful getting into the details of it. So thanks, Al. Really enjoyed it.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. See ya.
Bye. Thanks again to Gordon for joining us today and elaborating a little on his book, which contains so much information that we couldn't get around to really give it the coverage that I feel it deserves. I especially recommend the analysis of the mythology. It's very interesting to see which elements that goes the furthest back. And of course, Gordon did mention something like that. He did say stuff like the world egg, Father Heaven, Mother Earth, the separation, the trickster, the demiurge, bringing civilization killing the dragon, a golden age, the flood, the apocalypse, etc. But in the book he goes a little deeper into it, so we can know what it really contains. But I will read a little excerpt from the book before we end here. But first, let me say, if you want us to get on guests whom you like to get the forum treatment, in other words, someone you like to hear in a deeper conversation through a long form model, most of the people we'd like to get on wouldn't come on because we're not big enough. So you can mend that. You can either help us become bigger by sharing and liking and all that stuff, and spreading our shows, because that's how we do it. It's the only way, the organic reach, despite Facebook, Google, YouTube, or all these conglomerates developing algorithms to keep shows like this down and to boost artificially the mainstream media. But another way that's also effective is if a show gets a good repute and it finally reaches these guests, because most of these authors, researchers, thinkers, whatever, they don't have time. They're not sitting watching YouTube videos all the day or listening to podcasts. They don't have time. If they did, they wouldn't become well-known people who we would want on. No, they're immersed in their work, so they're kind of dependent a little on their audience and their readers and whatnot. So you can, if you're in touch with anyone, or if you're a supporter of anyone, or on their pages, on email, in their forums, whatever, if they have a public reach, if they have an interaction with John Doe, you can put us on the map. And that helps a lot until we reach decent numbers. So keep that in mind, because there's a bunch of interesting folks I'd like to have on, not just on this series, but including in this series about our ancient past. And if and when I do get them on, I promise you we're gonna squeeze out of them original takes, and you'll hear them in a new setting, different aspects to what the usually run-of-the-mill interviews they give. Okay, let's now turn to the book Starships. I have no idea why Gordon insists on pitching this to magicians, as he calls it. First off, that's a very small group in terms of numbers compared with the rest of people who would be interested in this. But second, it's not really true, although of course it is true in that magicians probably will appreciate this book. But so will a lot of other folks, including, I suspect, most of the listeners. And I've read it, and I can testify to that you don't have to be a magician or have much insight into that oddity to get the book. I'd rather say this is the magician's take on an objective field, which is the paleontology, the distant past. So, that said, I'm going to read a little excerpt called Digging in the Wrong Place. This book tells the story of at least one advanced culture that existed prior to the end of the Ice Age, and the survival of some of its cultural practices and spirits down into the practice of Western magic in the 21st century, albeit in dramatically different outerwear. So, is it an alternate history book, which puts it in, shall we say, mixed company? One of the great gifts of the Laurasian model is that it provides a counter-check of linguistic, genetic, and archaeological evidence to some of the bolder claims of alternate history. It is worth highlighting some of these claims so you can see how wheat is separated from chaff. 1. Looking for Noah's Ark. Noah is a recent example of a much older flood myth inherited by Near Eastern cultures. Why then would we expect to find a 3,000-year-old boat on a hill when the original story is at least 10,000 years old? The construction of ritual boats, on the other hand, is attested to all across the Laurasian footprint. 2. Plato's Atlantis. A variant of the above error, with the addition of mistaking technological complexity for cultural complexity, because that is what we value in the West. Atlantis is an example of a retained memory of earlier cultures, to be sure, and very possibly a retained memory of the first Laurasian culture. 3. The location of the Garden of Eden. Eden is a Near Eastern variant of Laurasia's Golden Age motif. The tree, snake, and immortality fruit make that pretty clear. Again, we face the problem of using as a map the literal description of a tumble-down 20,000-year-old story that was first told a long way from Judea. 4. The Nephilim and the Book of Enoch. Another example of a retelling of the much older Laurasian concept of the descent of spirit beings and an age of half-human, half-divine rulers and cultural heroes. If it happened in any physical way, it happened tens of millennia prior to the story of Enoch. 5. Similarities between Mesoamerica and Egypt. There are certainly many similarities between these two regions. Typically, this is expressed as how could this be when they are separated by so much time and distance, ergo aliens. The similarities are entirely predicted in the Laurasian model, whereby it was Laurasian cultures who colonized both areas between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago and retained variants of the same motifs. Dynastic Egypt and Mesoamerica may have had no contact, but wind the clock back far enough and the transmission vector becomes clear. 6. Literal interpretation of Moses. These are typically accompanied by a confused description of the Amarna period of ancient Egypt, with Akhenaten inventing monotheism, sometimes because of aliens, and then something to do with swamps, chariots, king tides, and a volcano. But Moses is a lawgiver type, along with Manu, Menes, etc., and the baby in the reeds storyline is attested in Laurasian mythology as part of either the culture, hero, flood, or golden age motifs. It may actually be Gondwana when you consider the Milky Way as the divine river, mother, as found in Australia. In any case, Akhenaten did not invent monotheism. He was not even a monotheist. 7. Out-of-place artifacts. Such as those collected by Klaus Dorna and Michael Cremo, a lot of these actually fall within my scheme of significantly more complex cultures existing before the end of the Ice Age. Over the next few years, these out-of-place artifacts may revert to being just artifacts. Some of the artifacts, particularly those in the Americas, with dates of 150,000 to 200,000 years or more, can be interpreted as evidence of the complexity of other hominins, or evidence of earlier, ultimately unsuccessful colonists, both of which are predicted in my thesis. And some of them, frankly, may be evidence of a full-blown extra-dimensional visitation more than 1 million years ago. Much of their evidence is hugely intriguing. 8. The Anunnaki. This topic will be dealt with at length later in the book, but it is sufficient to say that rather than aliens arriving in nuclear-powered rocket ships to create mankind to mine gold, to save the atmosphere of their home planet, a more satisfying interpretation is that the Sumerians had the most vivid example of the Golden Age era of demigods motif out of anywhere in the Laurasian footprint. Else you have to explain why these are dozens of similar motifs around the world that resemble an extraterrestrial event that really happened in one specific part of it. 9. Egyptians in America, Australia, etc. Sure, why not? Nothing but an improved understanding of ancient maritime technology and the loosening bonds of academic timidity prevent the suggestion that transoceanic trade or exploration was undertaken by dynastic Egypt. However, the commencement of dynastic Egypt is fairly well corroborated around 3500 BCE, which is vastly too late to have caused a cultural transfer to or from the Americas or Australia. Ancient Egyptian culture extends much further back than dynastic Egypt, of course. As a final note, I'd like to say we didn't have enough time at the end there, me and Gordon, to really discuss properly the question of advanced prehistoric civilizations. And this time I wasn't even prepared, so I couldn't hit him in the head with factoids, but I suspect he knows about most of that stuff already. So it's not, I think, that he or I would be swayed. It's just that you would get a better elaboration of why he sticks to this model, which, again, is safeguarded anyway by having room for the more exotic anomalies. And indeed, Gordon is more a supporter of pushing the advancement further back. Now, I think, as I guess came through in the program, that even though the modern human strain can be tracked back to Africa, that doesn't mean there wasn't human anywhere else. When that strain reached, let's say, Americas or other places in the world, there were already people present. But back in the day, there was much more racial variations, should one say, because they couldn't just take an airplane and mix that easily. It would take much more time to get the mingling, and indeed the mingling did happen anyway, because most of us can be traced back to it. There are still major differences, like I said, the sub-Saharan Africans not having the Neanderthal gene. And I don't know, maybe there's also people who doesn't have the Denisovan gene. And who knows, maybe other of those early strains. And I have to look into that to educate myself on that. But it doesn't really matter, because the point is the same. Earth was flooded with people, has always been. But for some reason, some die out, others get mingled in, consumed, if you like, genetically, like the Neanderthals, and others survive more pristine, like the sub-Saharans. So the melting pot that is the Earth, there's really this notion of a pure lineage is ludicrous when a genetic enters the scene, if we are talking about an absolute perspective. In terms of local selected portions of our timeline, that's something else, of course, and same with culture. But ethnically, we have to upgrade our realizations, and the mainstream model is that we are unchanged for at least 200,000 years. Now they pushed it even further back. They always do. It always go backwards and backwards, hence confirming stuff like Blavatsky. But enter the actual evidence, like Cremo has pointed out, and we find the human being millions of years old. And in a million-of-year perspective, we have room for advanced civilizations, blossoming and falling many times around. And if things are not linear but cyclical, there's no reason at all why the culture we have today and the so-called civilization, and especially the mechanical and the technological aspect of it, could not be present also in the past. There's no argument for it only happening now. There's nothing special about us. If anything, it shouldn't have happened. Maybe that's the best argument for the ancient astronaut or alien hypothesis. We're too stupid to really be able to develop all this stuff. So with all that into account, it seems we have to go further back to dig up evidences of stuff like the Atlantean Ocean. And we will. I have many people lined up for the future. But there won't be too many episodes in the Antediluvian series in 2019, because we're going to give focus to other series that year. But we'll return to it in 2020. There will be a few, and I have already lined up a couple more. Although they will be produced in this year, they will probably not be released until next year. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, spread the word and keep supporting us any way you can. Thanks to you. I've been your host today. Until next time, sincere regards and be seeing you.
Who is number one?